Hi, this is Sandra, and I'm very excited to share the results of the research I've been doing on the need for strategic communication and public relations professionals to use ethical and equitable storytelling practices in our work. To quickly give an example that I hope helps people consider how this may matter in your own work, early on in my time working at International Student and Scholar Services, I wrote a story and asked an international student to approve it, which he did. I later, however, decided to use a shorter version of that story elsewhere, and I received an angry phone call from an ISS staff person asking why I thought it was for me to change the story without the student's approval, since I couldn't really know what the student would feel is important when sharing their experience. As I became increasingly concerned about these questions of ethics, equity, and power, I found myself overcompensating and forgetting the needs of my organization when writing stories. This was the issue I wanted to pursue in my research, and it was key to my decision to add a minor in literacy and rhetorical studies to my strategic communication master's here at the University of Minnesota. Before I begin, I do want to make you aware that my research is centered around a discussion of the topic of sex trafficking, and I will mention incidents of police violence along with examples of racist brand names. While I am not sharing graphic content, I do want to give people the opportunity to either turn off the presentation or make other arrangements if necessary. My presentation will now be divided into 4 sections. First, I will talk about my research plan and why I decided to do this research. Next, I will provide some basic background information on the topic of sex trafficking, along with the secondary research I collected. I will then move on to talk about the interviews I did for my primary research. And finally, I will share my recommendations for work practices communicators can adopt. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using the term communicators to refer both to the work done by strategic communication and public relations professionals, as my work has always contained both of these roles, and I believe my recommendations fit all types of communication activities. So to begin, I want to explain why I decided to do my final capstone research on this topic. The need for communicators to consider the ethical, equity, and power implications of our work is something I strongly believe should be a foundation of our field, and it is something we should each consider as a basic responsibility in our work. Throughout the strategic communications curriculum, we have talked about the importance of being intentional in developing strong brands that are understood and valued by our organizations and businesses stakeholders. Storytelling is an important tool we have when doing this, as it allows people to experience, rather than simply just read about what our organizations do. As one of our former instructors, Matt Kaharski, explained to me in an interview, in a strategic communication setting, whether it's corporate or not-for-profit, the stories you tell are containers for key messages that are designed to educate, inform, and persuade. The use of stories is inherently self-centered, as you don't tell a story without it serving a strategic purpose. So by definition, you're going to choose stories that help further your agenda, and within those stories, you respect the actors while highlighting the elements that get your point of view across. Through my additional courses, I was fortunate enough to have conversations with social workers and teachers, the types of direct service and program staff members that many of us work with. And they told me about the extreme discomfort that they can feel when communicators ask them to suggest people that have useful stories, because they're concerned about just how that communicator might choose to misuse or co-opt that story. To quote a pair of scholars writing specifically about working with victim survivors of sex trafficking, "Story is a powerful medium. A well-told story can make an issue like human trafficking personally relevant to those who hear it. However, it is the responsibility of social service agencies and not-for-profit to protect the well-being of survivors and reflect on why they are considering using a survivor's story. Is sharing the story therapeutic and beneficial for the survivor, or is it a way to seek a benefit for the agency? Ultimately, there is no cause significant or important enough to jeopardize the emotional and physical well-being of a survivor. Survivors of human trafficking have overcome exploitation, and they should not be further commodified by those trying to help." When sharing stories, we must always remember that we are using the words and experiences of real people, and therefore, we must always be aware of both the needs of our organization and the individuals whose stories we share. But how do we do that? How do we tell the type of short and tight stories that we need in today's fast-paced social media world, while also ensuring an individual doesn't feel like we're simply trying to fit them into a message box? That is what I wanted to explore in this research, so I could provide some answers regarding what communication professionals can do to meet this dual responsibility of developing communications that fulfill organizational objectives while also ensuring we honor and respect the individuals whose stories we share. To do this, I conducted 9 semi-structured interviews with communications professionals working in anti-trafficking and related organizations between June 8th and July 15th. It is important to note that these interviews occurred while many of these communicators had been working from home for several months due to COVID-19, and fairly shortly following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, as many of the interviewees mentioned one or more of these events during our conversations. I also did 7 background interviews with individuals who were experts on various topics, and I reviewed the existing research available in strategic communications and public relations literature for discussions of ethics, equity, and power concerns for communicators. While I was able to identify some critical public relations scholars who had done some interesting work, no one seemed to be really examining the exact problem that I have identified, and few of the critical scholars seemed to tie their work back to concrete work practices. I next chose to turn to the conversations happening between practitioners, and was fortunate to discover the Ethical Storytelling Project. This is a group of nonprofit practitioners and storytellers who have written a powerful ethical storytelling pledge. This served as a significant tool in informing my research. So now to turn specifically to the issue of sex trafficking. I chose this particular topic after taking a course this spring at the Humphrey School on research and policy with marginalized populations, where it was a focus. As we discussed the topic and the complex path victim survivors must follow for healing, I was struck by just how important it is for a victim survivor to feel cared about, validated, and heard, particularly by those organizations that they turn to for help. And I became alarmed by the potential harm I could do if I were to come into one of these scenarios that focused solely on getting the perfect story. To give a little background, the current definition in the United States states that sex trafficking exists whenever a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or if the individual performing the act is under 18 years old. Despite the relative simplicity of this definition, however, confusion continues to exist in the public about what constitutes sex trafficking, and this continues in a large part due to the very practices of the organizations that seek to eliminate the practice. As I found in my secondary research, victim advocates and scholars have significant concerns about the communication practices of anti-trafficking organizations. Whether it is through simplistic narratives that rely heavily on xenophobia, racism, and sexism to create a predictable cast of stereotypical characters, the use of problematic visuals that include a heavy presence of ropes and chains and divide victim survivors between ideal victims and unworthy prostitutes, or the practice of pressing victim survivors for the gruesome details of the worst part of their lives. These communication practices led one pair of scholars to state, while most involved in the anti-trafficking movement are well-intentioned, few are intentional. Acts of awareness undertaken by allies are often harmful to the very victims and survivors they are declaring need to be rescued. In the name of anti-trafficking awareness, survivors are frequently re-exploited and taken advantage of in pursuit of a story that has an emotional pull. I next set out to do interviews with anti-trafficking communicators, and I'll be honest in saying that having done this secondary research, I was pretty nervous about what I'd find. While my results can't be generalized beyond the individuals I interviewed, I am happy to say, however, that I found the communicators to be at least partially aware of the potential concerns and willing to address them in their communications. And I identified 3 major themes that serve as the top-level findings for my research. First, the organizations seek to balance the benefits and concerns of asking victim survivors to share their story. All of the communicators stated that they use victim survivor stories in some form, although not always in the same way. One individual who took the strongest line said that they will only share stories that are from published authors rather than their own clients, as they believe asking clients creates the possibility for re-exploitation. While none of the other organizations took this hard of a line, many did talk about the concern of whether it is appropriate to approach a current client for a story, since the individual may not feel comfortable saying no. The individuals I interviewed, therefore, either wait until a person has exited the program before asking to share their story, or for those who do approach current clients, they always explicitly tell the person that the organization will support them whether or not they choose to share their story. Finally, an additional concern communicators must balance is the uncertainty of how a victim survivor will respond to the experience of sharing their stories. For some, this can be an important part of their healing, but for others, recounting their experience can also cause them to re-experience the trauma. And it's not always possible for the communicator or a staff member or the individual to know how that person will respond until they've started sharing their story. Finding number 2 is that communicators cannot sensationalize the issue or tell stories that simply perpetuate stereotypes, but they also must ensure that their stories represent and validate the real and varied lived experiences of victim survivors. As one of my interviewees explained, sometimes in this field, we work out of both extremes. There's a tendency for people to dramatize or sensationalize, but the pendulum sometimes swings too far in the opposite way, where people are so worried about triggering or wondering how palatable can I make this, that they're not really conveying the real truth and the reality of trafficking and prostitution that is horrific. It needs to be a both and, where we don't do either extreme, but we do try to be representative of people's experiences. My third and final finding is that the communicators recognize the need to ensure they are using a respectful process that puts the needs of victim survivors first, even if that means not sharing a story or losing a communication opportunity. This is obviously a difficult concept for those communicators who have only been focusing on the needs of their organization, but it is essential for those working in organizations whose mission are to benefit their clients. As such, many of the communicators talked about the processes they use to always be in contact with direct service and program staff in their organizations that work directly with the individuals. As one of these communicators shared, I think it is very critical for communications professionals to consult with the direct service providers and advocates, because those who are actually on the ground working with the human beings can be very different from a more detached professional that knows about an issue in an academic or ideological way. In addition to knowing the most about what is happening in an individual situation, these direct service and program staff often have in-depth training and experience with working with victims of trauma, and therefore, they are more likely to know what could be triggering for an individual or whether an interview should ultimately be stopped. One of the largest problems the communicators shared with me centers around the pressure to get media attention. Due to the sensitivities I have already discussed, the communicators cannot quickly respond to media requests, and they must always be prepared for the possibility that a victim survivor will withdraw from an interview they had previously agreed to. Additionally, 2 of the communicators also talked about challenging situations they've faced where reporters decided not to use a victim survivor's story since the individual wanted to remain anonymous. And in one of these situations, it was even after the victim survivor had done an interview. So, now that I've shared that, I will now turn to my final section of recommendations about potential work practices. This was something I was really excited to give thought to, as while the research and my previous conversations with professionals made me understand the essentialness of this duty, they unfortunately didn't do little to help me figure out what I should actually do in my day-to-day work. But before I give those recommendations, I want to address the obvious question. Is ethical storytelling only a concern for nonprofit communicators? Why should business leaders care? While it is true that most communicators will not deal with an issue as complex or sensitive as sex trafficking, I strongly believe all communicators must consider the power and responsibility that comes with our roles as storytellers and gatekeepers of information. We make choices every day about whose story is considered important, who to listen to, and what information should be shared with the public. And this requires that we challenge ourselves to think past our assumptions and simple organizational interests. Additionally, in today's world of increased customer, shareholder, and stakeholder activism, people are becoming more and more attuned and willing to call out false claims from organizations. So communicators must always be aware of whether the materials they are producing hold true to the organization and its activities. All of this must start with the stories we write. So to turn to my recommendations, I have divided them into two sets. The first being specifically for communicators working with victims of trauma, and the second set being for communicators more broadly. While I don't have time to talk about each recommendation fully here, I have provided further information in my paper, and I'm happy to do so in response to questions. To list the first set of recommendations for individuals working with victims of trauma, they are to 1, collaborate with program and direct service staff to identify individuals who will benefit from sharing their story with the public and to ensure a respectful process that empowers victim survivors. To 2, follow deep consent practices and trauma-informed interview techniques, including naming the power dynamic that exists in these situations. 3, use extreme care when selecting visuals for your publications, particularly if you're using photos of actual victim survivors. 4, have discussions about the feasibility and ethics of paying victim survivors for their stories. And 5, educate the media and organizational leadership about the sensitivities and challenges of connecting victim survivors and reporters. To look specifically at item number 2, this recommendation is encapsulated by the idea of deep consent. This was an idea put forth in the Ethical Storytelling Pledge, and it is the expectation that communications professionals will go past simply asking a person to sign a form that gives the organization the right to use their story, and instead calls on each of us to have in-depth conversations with the individual about exactly how and why we want to use their stories. This is calling us to specifically talk about the potential dangers also that exist from sharing a person's stories publicly, particularly in an online environment. Deep consent is ultimately about shifting the overall story sharing experience to be one that is a partnership between the individual and the communicator, rather than a one-off conversation where the communicator then makes all the decisions. And now to talk about my recommendations for all communicators. To list them, they are to 1, challenge misinformation, myths, and stereotypes in communications through being cognizant of your own biases and intentional research, planning, consultation, and hiring. 2, use strength-based messaging and audit all of your existing publications. 3, follow informed consent practices and know that it is more than just covering your legal liability and responsibility. 4, discuss your photo disclosure requirements and whether someone is blocked from participating in your events or programs simply due to not wanting to be photographed. And 5, consider whether you are the appropriate person to write a story or whether you should be hiring a freelancer or making alternate arrangements. The item I will highlight here is recommendation number 2 regarding the use of strength-based messaging. To quickly explain it for those who aren't familiar, strength or asset-based messaging is a writing and framing technique where an organization is choosing to talk about opportunities rather than challenges. To look specifically at this example, it is from an organization called Step Up that changed their language to affirm that teens already have the skills that they need rather than focusing on cancer interventions. I encourage all communicators to take time to look at their own communications to consider what messages they are spreading. So to conclude, I just have a few final messages. While we are not journalists who are tasked with sharing the complete and unvarnished truth, therapists whose sole responsibility is to the betterment and healing of the individual, or novelists or screenwriters who are writing stories that are simply meant to entertain, all communicators must be conscious of our responsibilities when we are choosing to use the words and experiences that belong to someone else. Whether a communicator is writing a story as simple as a customer talking about the benefits of their purchase, or as complex as a personal account from a victim survivor, most people who are being profiled will likely have opinions about what information they do and do not want to have shared, and how or where they would want their story to be told. So, what is ethical storytelling, and how does it help communicators balance their dual responsibilities to their organization and the individuals whose stories they share? For strategic communication and public relations professionals, it's an invitation and commitment that opens opportunities to authentically and ethically share another person's stories so you can reach success together. Thank you.